The light came back wrong. That was the first thing Dara Osi noticed. Not the hum of the dimensional field generator. Not the cascade of equations resolving on her screen, like dominoes falling in the right direction for the first time in 6 years. Not even the low throb of pride that had been living behind her sternum since 3 a.m. When the numbers aligned, no, she noticed the light. The afternoon sun pushing through the lab window had the quality of something translated. Too flat, too even, like a photograph of sunlight rather than sunlight itself. She blinked and looked again. Normal, just tired eyes. Mom. Priya was standing in the doorway of the lab with her weekend bag, the one with the patched strap and the iron-on constellation patches that Dara had put on herself 3 summers ago, Orion slightly crooked. You said we were going to the reservoir. I know. Dara didn't look up from the screen. Give me 20 minutes. You said 20 minutes an hour ago. Then give me the 20 minutes I owe you. She heard her own voice and didn't like it. The clipped thing it became when the work was close. She turned around. Priya was 12 now, which meant she'd learned to keep her face neutral when she was hurt. Learned it from her father probably, that careful blankness. The bag strap was twisted in her hands. Hey, I'm sorry, I mean it. Come here. Priya came slowly the way kids do when they want you to understand that the coming is provisional, that they reserve the right to be unpersuaded. Dara pulled her in and held her for a moment. She smelled like the coconut shampoo from Marcus's apartment. The weekend was half over. I cracked it, Dara said quietly, into Priya's braids. Cracked what? The thing I've been working on. The big thing. She pulled back enough off to see her daughter's face. I think I found a way through. Through what? I'll explain it tonight. Reservoir first. I promise, she meant it. She always meant it. But when Priya went back to the hall to get her shoes, Dara turned to the screen once more and saw the dimensional fold index sitting at 0.9997. 1 decimal shy of the threshold. And the 20 minutes became an hour, and the hour became the early dark, and by the time she surfaced, Priya was asleep on the lab couch with her shoes still on, and the reservoir was a thing that had happened to other people. The Veth did not arrive with war drums. That is a human imagining the need for ceremony before violence. The Veth arrived the way a tide arrives, incrementally then all at once. Their first signal reached Earth's deep space arrays in the autumn of the year that Dara Osi cracked the dimensional fold problem. Their first ship reached the orbital plane 14 months later. Their first communication, translated through 3 layers of algorithmic interpretation, was brief. We have observed your dimension. It is resource suitable. You are occupying it inefficiently. We will require it within 1 of your years, that was all. No negotiation offered. No curiosity expressed about the 8 billion people currently using the dimension inefficiently. A landlord's notice slid under the door of a species that had not known it was renting. The UN called it the Veth notification. People on the street called it other things. Dara, sitting in the emergency convening of the Global Science Consortium 48 hours after the translations cleared, called it what it was, a property dispute. And she happened to have spent 6 years building the legal argument, metaphorically speaking. They're not coming for our bodies, she told the assembled room, which contained 17 Nobel laureates, 4 heads of state via secure feed, and 1 retired general who kept clicking a ballpoint pen. They're coming for our dimensional address. The Veth don't exist in a single dimension the way we do. Their biology evolved across at least 3 simultaneous spatial frameworks. What they're calling resource suitable is the specific geometry of our reality. They want the house, not the people in it. That's actually good news. The retired general stopped clicking his pen. Dr. Osi, I'm struggling to identify the good news. The good news, Dara said, is that it's a real estate problem, and I know how to move. She had been close before. 4 times in 6 years she'd brought the fold index to within a percentage point of threshold, and 4 times the field had collapsed in ways that ranged from disappointing to catastrophic. The second collapse had destroyed the original lab at the university. The third had temporarily unfolded a space the size of a coffee table into a configuration that the graduate students who witnessed it described, uniformly and independently, as wrong. Not dangerous, not frightening, simply geometrically incorrect in a way that made your eyes insist you look away. The fourth collapse had cost Dara her marriage. Not directly. Nothing is ever direct. But Marcus had been in the hall outside the lab when the fourth field dropped, and the dimensional harmonic had passed through the building at a frequency that, as it turned out, resonated specifically with the inner ear. He'd had vertigo for 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, lying in the dark while the world tilted, He'd apparently done a great deal of thinking about what kind of life he was living, and whether the woman he'd married had any room for that life inside her work. By the time the vertigo passed, he had an answer and a lawyer. Dara had thought the loss would slow her down. Instead, it had sharpened her. Grief is sometimes like that. Not a weight but a file, stripping away everything extraneous until what remains is clean edge. She'd rebuilt the lab in the basement of a decommissioned industrial building on the east side of the city, negotiated her custody schedule around her research cycles, and gone back to work with a precision that surprised even her. She was not a machine. She still cried in the car, but in the lab she was something close to complete. The VETH notification changed the stakes but not the method. The fold was the fold. She'd been building a door, and now she needed it more urgently. That was all. Except Priya. The VETH's advance unit arrived 7 months into the year's grace period. They did not land. They established what the military analysts called a dimensional anchor point, a fixed location in low orbit where the geometry of local space had been quietly, permanently adjusted, like someone hammering a nail into a wall to hang a picture. The picture, presumably, was the Veth civilization. The nail was currently the size of a small building and generated a field that made GPS satellites in a certain orbital band spin in lazy, confused circles. Dara watched the feed from the anchor point on the lab monitor while she ran calibrations. The structure was beautiful in an inhuman way. It had the quality of things that have never considered whether they should be beautiful, built by minds that never developed aesthetics because aesthetics were unnecessary. All function, no sentence. What does it feel like? Priya asked from the couch. She was here more often now since Marcus had taken a project in Stockholm. The custody schedule had become theoretical. Priya lived in the lab. What does what feel like? Knowing you have to fix this, knowing it's on you. Dara considered the question seriously. Priya had always deserved serious answers. Clarifying, she said finally. Everything extra drops away. You know exactly what matters. Priya looked at her. Do you, though? A 12-year-old can say something that takes 20 minutes to land. It landed later, when Priya was asleep and Dara was alone with her screens, and she turned and looked at her daughter's face. Slack and young and unguarded in sleep the way children's faces are, all the careful neutrality dissolved, and felt something that had no name in the language of physics. The fold index read 0.9998. The Veth were not cruel. That was the assessment of every xenopsychologist on the planet. And it was the assessment that made everyone most afraid. Cruelty implies feelings about the other party. The Veth had no feelings about humans because the Veth had not previously conceptualized humans as a relevant category. Their surveys of Earth's dimension had been conducted at scales where biological life was statistical noise. When humans made contact, expressed distress, explained the situation, the Veth had paused, briefly, and then offered what they clearly considered a generous accommodation. They would delay the dimensional acquisition by 1 of your years to allow for organic relocation. Where, they were asked. They provided a set of coordinates. The coordinates led to a dimensional zone that human instruments confirmed was technically habitable. Air, water, adequate radiation shielding. What they did not mention was that the zone was also being reviewed for acquisition by a Veth subsidiary, or that the zone's dimensional geometry was slightly misaligned with human biology. A misalignment that would cause no acute harm but would, over generations, reshape the descendants of anyone living there in ways that were unclear. It was the dimensional equivalent of a landlord's offer to move you to a unit with a slow gas leak. Technically a unit. Dara had read the full analysis at 3 in the morning and then sat very still for a long time. Then she'd opened her derivation notes and started working on the problem she'd been circling for 6 months. Not just opening the fold, but locking it open. Sustaining it, making a door that could take 8 billion people through. The day the fold index hit 1.00 was a Tuesday. Priya was at school. The lab was very quiet. The generator hummed at a frequency Dara had spent 3 years tuning, and the dimensional field opened in the cleared space at the center of the room, with a sound like someone very gently pulling tape off a surface. A clean tearing sound. Almost polite. It was not spectacular. It was a vertical rift approximately 2 meters tall and half a meter wide, its edges precisely defined, shimmering slightly. Not the dramatic shimmer of movie effects, but the subtle shimmer of a heat mirage, the way air shivers over hot pavement. Through it, clearly visible, was somewhere else. A landscape that was not the industrial east side of the city. Low amber hills. A sky of a blue that was a different blue from the blue outside the window, richer, with more violet in it. A wind moving through grasses that were the same color as earthgrass, but not quite the same shape. Dara stood in front of it for a long time. Her heart was doing something. She didn't have calibration equipment precise enough to measure. Then she called the consortium. Then she called Marcus in Stockholm. Then she picked up her phone to call Priya and put it down. She would tell her in person. She wanted to see her daughter's face when she said it. She waited in the lab with the fold open, sitting on the couch where Priya slept, watching the amber hills through the rift as the afternoon tilted toward evening. The light through the fold was different from the light in the lab. It was the light she'd noticed months ago, the quality of something translated. She understood now why it had seemed that way. It had been a signal. The door had been trying to tell her it was ready. The consortium's response was not celebration. It was structured, cautious, professionally optimistic, which is the way institutions respond to miracles they haven't budgeted for. There were committees, there were working groups, there were security concerns. There were questions about the stability of sustained folds at large aperture, about the logistics of moving 8 billion people in 5 months, about whether the destination dimension had been properly surveyed, about legal frameworks for the transition. Dara answered all the questions. She answered them in rooms, in calls, in written reports that she sent at 4 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. She ran stability tests. She expanded the aperture incrementally. She brought in a team, 4 physicists she'd worked with before, 2 engineers, a dimensional cartographer named Soon, who mapped the destination dimension with the care of someone was drawing a coastline for the first time and kept saying, "It's beautiful," in a quiet voice while he worked. And she ran the other numbers. The ones she hadn't mentioned in committee, the ones she'd been running in private, late, after everyone else went home. The fold worked. The fold was stable. A portal large enough for mass transit was theoretically achievable within 4 months. Theoretically, but the fold generator that could sustain that aperture at that stability for that duration would require a power draw that exceeded any existing infrastructure by a factor of 3. And the dimensional resonance of a sustained large aperture fold would be detectable by the VETH at their anchor point. Detectable and interpretable within hours of activation, which meant there would be a narrow window. Open the large fold, begin transit, and the VETH would know. They would respond. They would not be violent. They were not cruel, but they would close the fold. Because they were not in the habit of allowing the contents of a dimension they were acquiring to simply leave. An occupied dimension was worth less to them. A dimension with 8 billion signatures was one thing. A dimension that was empty and stable, freshly vacated, would be worth considerably more. They would close the fold, so the window had to be used completely. 8 billion people, coordinated, moving, in the time between fold activation and VETH response. Dara had checked those numbers 17 times. They did not become better with checking. The solution came from Priya. Not from the physics of it. From a Tuesday afternoon when they were finally, actually, at the reservoir, the one Dara had been promising for months. Priya was skipping stones and explaining a geometry concept she'd learned in school. The way the curve of a stone's path across water is determined by the angle of release. How a shallow angle means more skips, but also more drift, more exposure to wind, more variables. You want fewer variables, Priya said, sending a stone across the water in a flat arc that touched down 5 times and then sank. You want the stone going so fast that the wind doesn't matter. Dara was watching the rings expand from where the stone had gone under. Speed is the variable I can control, she said. Priya looked at her sideways. I'm talking about rocks, Mom. I know. Dara was already somewhere else. Not the checking out of the present somewhere else, but the other kind, where the person next to you is the reason you got there. I know you are. The answer was not to open one large fold. The answer was to open many small ones simultaneously, geographically distributed. Hundreds of folds, each aperture sized for a district, a neighborhood, a manageable human unit. Individual generators could sustain smaller apertures on available power infrastructure. The VETH would detect the resonance, but the resonance of distributed small folds would read on their instruments as noise, as dimensional static, not as intentional action. Not immediately. It would still be close. Terribly close. But close was a different problem from impossible. Dara presented this to the consortium at 5 in the morning with coffee she'd made badly and a slide deck she'd built in 4 hours. There were 47 people on the call, which was not enough people to authorize a plan for moving humanity, but which was the most people she could get at that hour. She walked them through the numbers, she showed them the resonance profiles. She answered questions until her voice was thin. At the end there was silence for a long moment. Then the retired general, who was on the call, who was always on these calls, who had stopped clicking his pen some weeks earlier, said, "When do we start?" They started building in week 19. The world knew by then. The Veth's presence in orbit was impossible to keep quiet, and the consortium had made the decision, not unanimously, but decisively, that people deserved to know what was happening and why, and what the plan was. The response was not panic, or not mostly panic. It was something more complicated and more human, a mix of terror and grief and stubborn practical energy, the species discovering that it had opinions about its own survival and that the opinions were mostly yes. Cities began the logistical transformation. The fold generator design was distributed open source to any engineering team that could build it. Supply chains reorganized. National borders became, for a period, nominal, not abolished but temporarily beside the point, because the point was the same for everyone. A German team shared a critical modification with an Indian team that halved fabrication time. A consortium of Pacific Island nations, facing dual erasure by sea level rise and alien acquisition, provided an atoll network that turned out to be ideal for harmonic stabilization of the distributed fold array. A retired Japanese engineer who had worked on MRI magnet design in the 1990s identified a resonance damping technique that reduced each generator's Veth-detectable signature by 60%. Dara worked. She slept 4 hours a night on the lab couch. She ate when Priya brought her food and forgot to eat when Priya was at school. Her hair went back. She wore the same sweater for days at a time. She had a list on the whiteboard of things that still needed solving, and the list never got shorter. Every solved problem revealed 2 unsolved problems behind it. But the character of the unsolved problems changed. They became smaller, more tractable. The list was still long, but it was no longer frightening. It was just work. Marcus came back from Stockholm. He showed up at the lab door with 2 bags, and a look on his face she hadn't seen in years. An openness, a willingness to be somewhere difficult. She didn't have time to process what that meant. She handed him a clipboard. "Generator installation schedule," she said. "Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We're behind." He took the clipboard. He sat down at the secondary workstation. He didn't say anything about the state of the lab or the state of her or the things they hadn't said to each other in 3 years. He pulled up the scheduling software and got to work. 3 weeks later, in the middle of the night, she woke up on the couch and he was asleep in the chair across from her, and Priya was asleep on the floor between them, her weekend bag used as a pillow. The constellation patches facing up, Orion still slightly crooked. Dara lay there in the dark for a while and didn't move. The Veth sent a second communication in month 10. This was unusual. They had sent only the one notification before. The second message was processed by the translation algorithms over 6 hours and read as follows. Dimensional activity detected. Query. What process is occurring? This was the Zkenoscologist noticed. The first question the Veth had ever asked of humanity. They had made statements. They had issued notices. This was curiosity. A functional curiosity. The kind a property manager might have noticing odd sounds from a unit before the lease expires, but curiosity nonetheless. The consortium debated whether to respond for 48 hours. Dara spent those 48 hours finishing the final calibration pass on the distributed array. When the debate concluded with a decision not to respond, the communication experts argued that any response would narrow the ambiguity that was currently buying them time. She was in the lab watching the array telemetry as 712-fold generators across 6 continents came into alignment for the first time. The array harmonic, distributed and dampened and carefully shaped by 60-year-old MRI magnet theory and Pacific atoll geometry and the work of 40,000 people in 11 months, sang back to her monitors at a frequency that was, she noted, very close to the frequency she'd tuned the original generator to 3 years ago. An infinite loop, an echo of the beginning. She allowed herself 20 seconds to find that beautiful. Then she moved to the next problem. The activation day was a Thursday. There had been extensive debate about what to call it. Some wanted a dramatic name. The consortium settled on Transition Day, which was accurate and unromantic, and Dara thought, exactly right. The thing didn't need a dramatic name. The thing was dramatic enough. The protocol was straightforward, which is to say that it was the simplest possible version of an extraordinarily complex operation, and that simplicity was itself a profound achievement. Each of 712 fold generators was assigned a transit zone. Each transit zone had a coordination team. Each coordination team had a signal to wait for and an action to take when the signal came. The action was, open your fold and begin transit. The signal would come from Dara. She was in the original lab, the basement of the decommissioned industrial building on the east side of the city, where it had started, where the fold index had first hit 1.000 on a quiet Tuesday. Priya was with her. Marcus was 2 floors up coordinating the Eastern Europe relay. The original fold generator, smaller now than the ones they'd built, intimate almost, the first version of the door, was running at the back of the room. Mom, Priya said. Yeah, you should open it. I know. So open it. She had given a speech to the consortium the night before, which was the only speech she planned to give. She had thanked the right people and credited the right teams. She had been clear that this was not a victory, that leaving a home is not a victory, that what they were doing was an act of survival and stubbornness and the refusal to be dispossessed by something that had never once thought to ask. She had said what she thought about humanity, which was that it was imperfect and unreasonable and, surprisingly, stubbornly attached to its own continued existence. She had said that she thought that stubbornness was worth carrying through the door. She had not cried. She was crying now, a little, standing at the generator panel with her hand on the activation sequence. She let herself do it because there was no one here she had to be composed for, just Priya, who had seen her cry before and had opinions about the importance of it. It's okay, Priya said. I know, it's just a door. I know, Shik wiped her face with the back of her hand. Okay. She looked at her daughter, the 12-year-old face, the careful learned neutrality entirely gone, replaced by something clearer and fiercer and more real. The constellation bag on her back, Orion still crooked. Ready? I've been ready. Dara pressed the activation. The fold opened with the same small, polite sound it had made the first time. That clean half-tier. 2 meters tall and half a meter wide in the center of the lab. The amber hills visible through it. The different blue sky. The violet tones in the atmosphere that soon the cartographer had been mapping for months, and which he'd told her, during one late-night calibration session, were caused by a slight difference in atmospheric scatter, completely benign. It would just make sunsets on the other side look like something you'd want to photograph. Across the world, she knew without seeing it, 711 other folds were opening. The telemetry was feeding to her secondary monitor, green lights cascading across the global display as each generator confirmed activation. It was slow at first, the cascade, the way a wave of light moving across a stadium begins with a single section, and then the whole thing ignites, and then it was fast, and then it was all of them, all 712. Every generator aligned, every transit zone opening. The FES instruments she had calculated would take somewhere between 40 and 60 minutes to interpret the distributed harmonic as intentional action rather than noise. 712 transit zones, 8 billion people, 40 to 60 minutes. She had run those numbers 17 times. She had not told anyone what she thought about them. What she thought was that they were impossible, and that humanity was going to do it anyway, because the alternative was to sit and wait to be dispossessed by something that had never learned to ask. They moved. That is the simple fact of it. That is what the histories written afterward would spend millions of words trying to do justice to, and mostly agree they had not. They moved the way species move when the only alternative is not moving. Not gracefully, not quietly, not without loss and chaos, and the particular grief of leaving behind the things too big to carry. They moved with their children and their parents and their photographs and their seed banks and their arguments and their religions and their languages and their recipes and their music. The ones who could move, helping the ones who couldn't. The strong ones carrying the ones who were not strong. The young ones guiding the old ones, the whole vast, unwieldy, unreasonable species choosing, collectively and imperfectly, to stay together. The transit coordinators reported compliance rates that the models had said were impossible. Transit zones in conflict regions, where a 40% participation rate had been optimistically projected, came back with 70, 80, 90%. A transit zone in a coastal city that had been partially evacuated 3 months earlier due to flooding reported a coordination team that had stayed behind specifically to ensure no one was left in the flooded districts. 2 coordinators had gone back through the water. Everyone got through. Dara monitored the telemetry. She counted green lights. She watched the cascade numbers and told herself not to do the math on the time elapsed because the math would not help. What would help was the next green light, and the next one, and the next. She sat on the lab couch, Priya's couch, the couch Priya had been sleeping on for a year now, and she watched the board. At 38 minutes, the Veth sent a third communication. Process identified, query. Authorization for dimensional transfer. Identify authority. The translation came through to her secondary monitor. She read it twice. Then she opened the response channel and typed 5 words, which were the only words that seemed accurate to the situation, which were the only words that needed saying. We are the authority here. She sent it. She went back to watching the board. At 51 minutes, 11 minutes after the window she'd calculated, the Veth activated a dimensional suppression field at their anchor point. The field propagated outward at the speed their technology allowed, which was fast but not instantaneous. 17 folds in the anchor point's direct resonance corridor flickered and collapsed. Transit coordinators had planned for this possibility. The corridors had redundant transit routes. And the collapse of 17 folds in the final minutes of transit resulted in a routing problem that was solved, in real time, by the transit coordinators in those 17 zones, using improvisational logistics that would later be studied in emergency management courses for decades. Nobody was left in those corridors. The suppression field reached the distributed array 18 minutes after activation. By then, the telemetry board showed 711 green lights and 1 yellow one. The original fold in the original lab, the one Dara was still standing in front of. She was the last one. She had built the last fold, and she was going to be the last one through it. This was not sentiment. It was engineering. Someone had to watch the board until the board was done, and she was the someone with the best data access. The amber hills through the fold were in late afternoon light now. The other blue sky was deepening toward evening. Soon had been right about the sunsets. She could see the beginning of one at the horizon, violets and deep golds that were not quite the colors of any sunset she'd ever seen, but were beautiful in the way that new things are beautiful when you've been working toward them for a long time. And they turn out to be real. Priya was already through. Marcus was through. 711 zones fully transited. The suppression field was 12 minutes away. She looked around the lab one last time. The whiteboard with the list she'd never fully cleared, the secondary workstation where Marcus had sat for 3 weeks becoming useful. The couch with the dent from a year of a 12-year-old sleeping in it. The generator, humming its tuned frequency, holding the door. She thought about a couch in a different lab. A failed marriage that had found its way back to something. A daughter standing at a reservoir explaining the physics of flat stones. She thought about the first time the light had come back wrong, and she hadn't known what it meant, and how long it had taken her to understand that some signals are already answers by the time you receive them. She thought, I should have gone to the reservoir sooner. Then she went through the door. The fold generator was designed to deactivate automatically 1 minute after the last biometric signature passed through. The suppression field arrived 8 minutes after Dara stepped through the fold. It found nothing to suppress. A door that had already closed, a lab that was empty, a planet whose geometry was, technically and as agreed, now available. They don't know what the Veth made of it. The communication channel on the Earth side closed with the fold. If the Veth sent off Sig, no one received it. On the other side of the door, in the world with the different blue sky and the violet sunsets, there were 8 billion people standing in amber light, blinking. They had arrived in the late afternoon of a world they had never seen, carrying everything they'd been able to carry, trailing grief and relief, and the enormous animal relief of still being together. Children were crying. Adults were crying. Somewhere, almost certainly, someone had already started to build something. Dara was standing in a field at the edge of a fold site, her fold generator 20 meters away, going through its shutdown sequence. Priya next to her with the constellation bag. The sun, different sun, slightly cooler, slightly more yellow-white, was low in the sky. Around them, the first of the violet-gold sunset colors were climbing the horizon. Soon had been right. It was going to be the kind of sunset you photograph. Priya didn't say anything for a while. Neither did Dara. They watched the sky change. Then Priya said, "Now what?" Dara thought about it. She thought about the lab she'd left, the equations she'd solved and the ones she hadn't, the list on the whiteboard that was never quite finished. She thought about a CC that had been handed a 1-year notice by something that did not consider it relevant, and had spent that year doing the most human thing it knew how to do, which was to refuse that framing entirely and find a different answer. She thought about the fold generator shutting down behind her and the specific quality of a door that has just closed. Now we figure out where we are, she said. Now we start the next list. The sunset continued to be unreasonable about its colors. Around them, the new world breathed its unfamiliar air, which was, her lungs confirmed, completely adequate. The first stars, different configurations, new shapes, were beginning to appear. Someone nearby was already pointing them out to a child, naming them, making them familiar. That's what humans do. They arrive somewhere that has no names for anything, and they start naming things, because unnamed places do not stay unnamed for long, because that particular human habit, making the strange into the known, making the frightening into the mapped, is the oldest and most unstoppable thing the species has. Priya sat down in the amber grass. She looked up at the emerging stars for a while. Then she pulled her sketchbook from the constellation bag and began to draw. Dara sat down next to her. The sun finished setting in its unreasonable colors. The new dark was deeper than Earth dark, quieter. No ambient light pollution. Not yet, not the first night, give it time. And the stars were more numerous than they'd ever seen, the full unfiltered sky of a world that had not yet learned to argue with the dark. She didn't look at the stars. She looked at her daughter's profile, bent over the sketchbook, already making maps. In the distance, through the dark, she could hear a city beginning.